Here, welcome to our weekly review of the articles that I published for Founder of the Day in the past week. As people are rolling in here, we get started. I just want to first of all note that it might look a little different today because apparently 7 o'clock this time of year is exactly when the sun shines directly through the window into the camera and ruins everything. So I hung up one of my Liberty & Co. t-shirts, my Great John Adams shirt, which shout out to Liberty & Co. Unsponsored. Lucky you, Tyson. That was the first shirt I grabbed. I was probably going to hang up one of my shirts because, you know, promote yourself, but I'm wearing it very selfishly. When I made some shirts, I made ones I wanted to wear. If you do want to support this site, go to founderoftheday.com where you can get one of these shirts or support me on Patreon. I would really appreciate it. Every single dollar now goes to help the channel and pay off things like web hosting and blah blah blah. If you don't want to support the channel, you can go to the only place that sells cooler merch than I do, which is Liberty & Co. Liberty&Co. Hopefully there's no problems. I ran into some problems last Saturday with my live feed. If I do have a problem, please feel free to leave me a comment and say things are freezing or whatever. I don't know if I can change the latency now that it started. Still figuring out how to do all these YouTube extra bits. I always do it at normal latency. Hopefully it works out. Alright, that's about a minute and a half. I don't want to waste any more of your time. Now some people have started rolling in. Of course, leave comments. This is the first time I am discussing on Wednesdays. This is the first Wednesday. We moved it from Saturday to Wednesday because people seem to think Wednesday was more convenient. I am realizing now that I'm doing it 7 o'clock Eastern time, which means it's 4 o'clock on the West Coast, and people might still have work. So if you want me to move it to 9, please leave me a comment and let me know about that, because I want to make it as convenient as possible for everyone to come chip in and ask questions and talk about the American Revolution. With no further ado, we'll start our first Wednesday session. We will only be doing 5 people because, well, I did one just this past Saturday before we moved it. So only 5 articles have come out since then. And we're going to start with a man named Christopher Leffingwell. Leffingwell was kind of unknown to me when I first heard his name. He ended up being a very important player in Connecticut. In fact, he was one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. He descended from the people who founded Norfolk. And Leffingwell had various industries. Now, when the Stamp Act came around in 1765, well, there was a stamp on paper. If you did anything with a paper, you were a lawyer or had a newspaper or blah blah blah, anything with paper. And we often forget that the people most affected by this were paper manufacturers. Now, there weren't a lot of paper manufacturers in British North America. Most of it was shipped in from overseas. But in Connecticut, there was one, Christopher Leffingwell. And Christopher Leffingwell was very not happy with the Stamp Act, and he became an early proponent of throwing off British taxation. There's also been rumors that he's even the one who convinced Jonathan Trumbull, the governor of Connecticut, to support the Patriots, and Trumbull would end up being the only royal governor who hung around and stayed as governor of his colony when it became a state. But that is, you know, up in the air. They were friends, and Leffingwell was an active patriot. Now, he had several other businesses he opened up just as the Revolution approached. Opened several mills and a hosiery manufacturer for stockings and such. But the most fun part about Christopher Leffingwell is he started manufacturing chocolate. He was, in essence, the candy man of the Revolution. Although there were a few other people who can be given this title. Isaac Roosevelt, a descendant of Franklin Roosevelt, was a sugar refiner, so, you know, can't give him all the candy credit, but Leffingwell made chocolate. And during the Revolutionary War, he worked very closely with the quartermasters general and commissary general to get supplies, including paper that he used. There were a variety of uses for his paper in the war, but most notably when they made shells for armaments, they wrapped them in paper. And he also, his chocolate was used as rations for the Continental Army. They didn't get that much chocolate, but they did get chocolate, and they came mostly from Christopher Leffingwell. Oh, Leffingwell also, early in the war, when Benedict Arnold from Connecticut wanted to go attack Fort Ticonderoga, Leffingwell was one of the few people who paid for him to attack Fort Ticonderoga. And actually, before that, I did forget to mention, Leffingwell, when the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened, the Massachusetts sent out the Lexington alarm, which was a man named Israel Biswell went out on horseback with a piece of paper that said, "Hey, we're going to war." And as he went along, everyone he talked to signed it to verify it was paper. And Christopher Leffingwell, when it came through Connecticut, signed the Lexington alarm before it went further south to New York and eventually Philadelphia. That's a brief look at Christopher Leffingwell. Not the most famous person, but a few important notes there. Okay. If you guys have questions or comments, let me know. I'm going to keep looking back. And we're going to move on to Eliphalet Dyer. Eliphalet. I always have trouble pronouncing his name. I want to leave out vowels as I say it. His name was Eliphalet Dyer. He was also from Connecticut. And he actually went and attended the Stamp Act Congress. Oh, I've got a question. Before we move on to Eliphalet, let's look at who had a question. Was that you, Ned? Where'd it go? There it is. What kind of chocolate did he make? How would he compare to today's chocolate? Oh, well, Ned, that's a great question, and I have no idea what the answer is. I will write that down. Of course, I'm going to pull out my paper. I'm going to write down chocolate and get back to you on it, because I don't know how the chocolate would compare. It is an interesting question. And this is a little off topic for your question, but for example, I know beer would taste very different from what we're used to today, and would have been a little more cloudy. Now, as for how they make, that's a very interesting question. When I was at Fort Ticonderoga last summer, there was someone doing a display of chocolate, and what they actually they were specifically talking about the Washington family at Mount Vernon and how they got chocolate, and a lot of that was imported. And they discussed how, they would have mixed it with certain things, and how it was basically cocoa powder. So I'm not aware of whether or not he was essentially importing the chocolate and just selling it as cocoa, or if he was actually making chocolate. I'm under the impression he was making it into chocolate. That's a great question. I apologize that I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I wish. Well, I will find a chocolate expert to help us figure out that question. So I apologize that I don't know the answer to that, but that's a fantastic question. I would assume it tasted a little bit different. I would, again, this is an assumption, so never assume, right? But I would assume it was more basically just cocoa. Milk chocolate, I wouldn't think. It would probably be, I would assume it was very rich. That's why their portions would have been very small when it was rationed out. I also know that the people are talking to about the Washingtons use it as a supplement in cooking more than as a dessert. Now, I don't believe this is what Leffingwell was doing. But, so it does vary throughout. That's a great question. I don't know a lot about chocolate in late colonial America. Interesting question. I probably should have researched that before this, but hey, now we're learning. We're learning together. As I said, Leffingwell is a fairly obscure character. And we'll move on to Eliphalet Dyer. Eliphalet Dyer was from Connecticut. He started the Susquehanna Company. And the Susquehanna Company was trying to settle land that is now in Wyoming Valley, Pennsylvania. And this land at the time was both claimed by Connecticut and Ash Cakes and Chocolate. Gross. Sorry, I lost my train of thought now. So, northeastern Pennsylvania was claimed by both Connecticut and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania for the obvious reasons that ended up being it's still in Pennsylvania now, but Connecticut, because its original charter essentially said, go to New York, skip over a little bit, and then go to the Pacific Ocean. So, the Susquehanna Company was started assuming it was part of Connecticut. Pennsylvania had a lot of criticisms with this, and also when the king issued the proclamation line of 1763 to make sure colonists and Native Americans kept their distance from each other and didn't start too much violence. Even though this area was not actually on the other side of the proclamation line, since it hadn't quite yet been settled, the British government seems to have considered it part of the, as if it should have been on the other side of the proclamation line. So he was forbidden from settling it. Now, I should note that even though Connecticut was having disagreements with Pennsylvania, and the people of Pennsylvania thought this was part of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin actually liked the ideas Dyer had. And while they weren't necessarily working together, they certainly weren't opposed to the goals each other had. Anyway, Dyer ends up going to London and trying to plead his case and be able to settle this land that his company had purchased to settle and move people to. And unfortunately, this was to no avail, which pretty much turned him into a revolutionary. He returned to Connecticut and was quickly sent to New York to be a delegate in the Stamp Act Congress. And he would continue being a patriot and was also sent to the First Continental Congress 9 years later, where he signed the Articles of Association, issuing the boycott against British goods. Dyer would actually spend most of the Revolution in the Continental Congress, but he returned home very frequently, which is why he didn't end up signing any of the other documents. Like, for all intents and purposes, he should have signed the Declaration of Independence, but he left, and then it was signed, and then he came back. And then he left, and they signed the Articles of Confederation, and he came back. So he just missed a lot more than that first document. He would end up going back to Connecticut, and he had been an associate justice this entire time on the Connecticut Supreme Court. And he actually spent 33 years as an associate justice on the Connecticut Supreme Court before finally being appointed Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court in 1789, right as George Washington was taking over as president for the first time. So that is the story of Eliphalet Dyer of Connecticut. Let's see if there's any more questions. Nope, not yet. Anyway, let's move on. So on Monday, I wrote about Zebulon Pike, who is a name I had known for a long time. My parents had visited Colorado many years ago, well before my brother moved there. And they ascended Pike's Peak, which is one of the tallest mountains in the Rocky Mountains and the tallest in the easternmost section of the southern part of the Rockies. I don't know a ton about the geography of the Rocky Mountains in particular. I realized as I was reading and writing about Zebulon Pike, I was like, I like geography a lot. I can't believe I don't know more about the Rocky Mountains. But I live on the East Coast. Call me an elite if you want. I just don't make it to Central America, the west center of the continent, all that frequently. I apologize. Wish I had more time and money to go traveling. That would be great. Anyway, Zebulon Pike is one of the most underappreciated explorers in American history. If I say Lewis and Clark or the Corpse of Discovery, I mean, most Americans know who Lewis and Clark is, even if they don't care about history at all. Not a lot of people know who Zebulon Pike is. Here's the thing, is Lewis and Clark were sent out west, and then Zebulon Pike was almost immediately sent north to Minnesota. Actually, while Lewis and Clark were traveling, Zebulon went north to Minnesota, negotiated treaties with the Native Americans, and then returned to civilization. So while he was the second person to lead an expedition out into the Louisiana Territory, he was the first to return. And while he didn't bring nearly as many scientific artifacts or you know, as much information as Lewis and Clark did, because Lewis and Clark were gone for like 2.5 years, Pike was gone for a few months. And his was not a scientific journey as much of Lewis and Clark's journey was meant to be. His was more, go treat with the Native Americans, see if we can get some of Minnesota for ourselves. And he did. He was fairly successful with that. And then he returned. And less than a year later, 6 months later, he returned, winter went by, and they sent him back out on another expedition. And this second expedition is known as Pike's Expedition. And he was supposed to trace the waters of several rivers back and kind of see what the boundaries between New Spain, as Mexico was called at the time, New Spain and the United States with the new Louisiana Purchase. He was supposed to figure out the boundaries, and first he went and he found Pike's Peak and many other mountains in the Rocky Mountains. Unfortunately, they tried to ascend Pike's Peak, but when they were waist deep in snow, they were like, and hadn't eaten for 2 days, they were like, maybe we should turn around, and they did. And then he went south to New Mexico. Essentially, today it's he was around the border of New Mexico and Colorado, where it turns out he had traveled either by accident or on purpose, probably by accident, into New Spain, where he was captured by Spanish authorities and brought to Santa Fe, which was the capital of the state of New Spain, aka Mexico, that he had invaded. Keep in mind, at this point in history, Texas, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, these are all part of Spain. So he was captured by Spain and held as a prisoner for a while, but they weren't, Spain and America at this point weren't on the good terms they were during the American Revolution. 30 years had gone by, but they weren't enemies. They were diplomatically friendly. So Pike was treated kindly. They were able to walk about the city, but they just weren't allowed to go anywhere or do much of anything. But he dined with the governor or mayor of the city and things like that. Eventually, because Napoleon was doing his thing over in Europe, Spain had to fight with Napoleon. They eventually gave up on holding these Americans hostage because the last thing they needed was to start a war with America. And Pike and his men were brought back and set free. But for a while there, it was kind of a tenuous diplomatic situation for several months. Now, Zebulon Pike was still a young man at this point. He was just about 30 when he was released from captivity after his second journey. He publishes a book titled The Expeditions of Zebulon Montgomery Pike, blah, 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 blah. It was a really long title, as they did back then. And it was a minor hit at the time, but it would end up going on to be translated into several languages, and was for most of the 18th century the definitive book to read if you were going to go out exploring in the West. Most of the people who would have taken the Oregon Trail would have read this book, and people going for the gold rush would have read this book, because he discussed everything. Again, he was the first American to travel to Minnesota, and the first one into Colorado, and the first one going, south to Mexico. And don't get me wrong, there were already Native American tribes there. The French had made it to parts of the northern part through Canada, and of course the Spanish had made it to this boat. But as far as Americans go, after the United States, he was the first one exploring the Louisiana Purchase, the parts that Lewis and Clark didn't do. And he does all of this, and then the War of 1812 breaks out. And he's still just 33. And he gets promoted to a brigadier general. He's one of the leaders. And there was a conflict called the Battle of York, where Americans invaded York in Canada. Now, today we know York as Toronto. Let's let that sink in. That in 1812, Zebulon Pike, who had explored the West, led American soldiers in an invasion, a successful invasion of Toronto. Again, it was called York at the time, and sadly, while the Canadians and British were evacuating the city, they lit some of their powder on fire and caused an explosion because they were destroying their stores. They didn't want the Americans who were invading to have it. And that explosion sent shrapnel out that killed several Americans, including a young Zebulon Pike. And a career that was already extraordinarily important to the early American West was unfortunately ended. And even worse, we would, much like the British in the Revolutionary War left Philadelphia for seemingly no reason, we would do the same thing for Toronto. So it was, I don't want to say it was all for naught, because it was important. And actually, that battle is one of the things that inspired the British to invade Washington, D.C. later in the War of 1812, as kind of a revenge hit. So that's the story of Zebulon Pike. He's the only founder I have and probably ever will write about who was exploring Colorado, which was refreshing to have a legitimate American founder in Colorado. Shout out Marty, my brother, who lives there now. Let's see. Have anybody no questions yet? You guys, I'm always ready for questions. Zebulon Pike is a fascinating character. And actually, I did put my book of the week I've recommended down below. It is, the name escapes me. It's about Zebulon Pike and Thomas Jefferson and the exploration of the West. And it's actually written by several different authors. Let me pull back the name up just to make sure I get it right. It's several different essayists who are students of not just the American founding, but the early American West. And they all write about different parts of Zebulon Pike's life. And it's called Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West. It's really interesting, especially because there's so many perspectives on it and the different parts of his life that I've glossed over here. So I recommend you check it out. There's a link below. And now we're going to move on to Sam Patch. Okay. Sam Patch is someone I've kind of been holding on to for a long time. It's hard to call him an American founder. He wasn't even born until Thomas Jefferson was closing out his presidency. So this one's a real stretch. There are certainly founders I've written about and discussed that are kind of a stretch. Sam Patch is the stretchiest that I've attempted thus far. But he is, for all intents and purposes, the first American stuntman, because Sam Patch became famous for jumping off cliffs. And he became really famous for it. We'll get there. So Sam Patch was a young man from Rhode Island, and he worked as a child laborer in a factory, and him and his friends would jump off a dam. And they kept climbing up higher to see who can jump the highest, and Sam kept jumping the highest. Years go by, and he ends up moving to Paterson, New Jersey, where he works in a factory and jumps off some bridges to impress people. And there was one bridge being built over Passaic Falls that people would go and watch them build this gigantic bridge, because that's what you did back there. If there wasn't a war going on, you didn't have any battles to go see from the next hillside, you watched them build a bridge. And Sam Patch one day climbs out in front of everyone on the bridge and jumps off. And people really liked it. So he kept doing it. And he would climb up ship masts and jump off. And climb up, waterfalls and jump into the water. And he'd do what you do jumping into a pool. He'd jump off and he'd keep his arms in and legs straight and he'd plunge in. And he kept jumping from, 80, 90, 100 feet. And this was a major feat at the time. And he became very good at advertising himself. And he would advertise himself, and he'd do his jump, and he'd take donations. And eventually, he earned the nickname, he earned several nicknames, but he earned the nickname Patch the Jersey Jumper. So Sam Patch decides, I'm going to run with this. I've got my name in the papers. I've made a little bit of money. I'm going to do the big one. I'm going to do Niagara Falls. Now, he goes to Niagara Falls, and he doesn't jump off of Niagara Falls. From my understanding, he jumped off the American side from a certain ledge off the falls. I'm having trouble describing the geographic layout of the falls, but it wasn't the tippy top of the falls you see on TV. He climbed up 100 feet and jumped down next to Niagara Falls. Landed in the river, and there's a boat circling looking for him, and an audience is looking for him, and then he pops up out of the water down there and comes up behind everyone and says, "Hey, what are you looking at?" And they're like, "Oh, there he is, Sam Patch." The problem is not enough people came, so he put word back out, and more people came. He did it again the next week. So Patch decides it's time to take the show on the road. First he gets a bear cub, because I guess it's self-explanatory. I have no words for it, that's for sure. So, priceless. So he gets a bear cub, and he moves to Rochester, New York, which is about an hour 20 by car nowadays. I live upstate New York, so that's how I judge the distance. It's the next city over at the time, down the Erie Canal. He goes there, and he gets ready, and he climbs up to the top, and first, well, it's 100 feet in the air, and over the Genesee Falls, right by Rochester, and he throws his bear cub off, because animal cruelty wasn't a thing. His bear cub lands in the water and swims out. He's like, okay, everything's great. So he jumps in. Everyone's happy, real impressed. But he doesn't make as much money as he had hoped. So, November's setting in. It's getting cold upstate New York. So, winter's here. He decides to do one last jump for the year, and he advertises it. He bills it as Sam Patch's last jump. Come on. Now's the time. And people show up. And this time, he built a scaffolding, a stage, that was about 25 feet higher. So he's jumping from 125 feet in the air into water. Goes up, throws the bear off, no big deal. Bear swims away. Patch climbs up, and something goes wrong. Because Patch jumps, but instead of having his usual legs out, arms in stance, he seems to be falling to the side. Now, there's discussions on whether or not he'd been drinking beforehand or just took a shot of whiskey to warm up because it was cold outside. There's people who think he might have slipped while he was climbing or slipped while he was at the top because he gave a speech. He liked to give a speech about how super awesome he was before he did these jumps. Allegedly, he compared himself to Napoleon. He was the Napoleon of jumping off this cliff or something along those lines. Literally, that's a paraphrase, but he definitely called himself Napoleon. But unfortunately, he jumps or slips and comes in sideways, hits the water, and never resurfaces. And this is in front of 8,000 people. He was attracting 7, 8, 10,000 people to his jump. He never resurfaces, and unfortunately, they don't find his body until 3 or 4 months later, 5 months later, the following March, down the river, once things are unfreezing. They find his frozen body. And he's buried in Rochester, New York. A very sad end to a still young man. He was just 22 years old. But he was one of the first entertainers, and I believe I saw Ned say he was the Evel Knievel. It's funny you say that. I tried to work in the title, Patch Knievel. Like, I couldn't do it. I tried to come up with something clever with Evel Knievel, but I couldn't make it happen. But yeah, essentially he was just the first stuntman, and he promoted himself wildly. In fact, he had a catchphrase. Now, I still can't figure out what it means, but his catchphrase is, "Some things can be done as well as others." Some things can be done as well as others. If you can tell me what that means, I would really appreciate it. I've tried it every possible way. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but it was something that was said across the young United States throughout the 1820s and 1830s. It was a common phrase that people said. I think what he's going for is, like, sometimes things happen. But again, I'm not entirely sure. However, to demonstrate just exactly how famous he was, President Andrew Jackson named his favorite horse Sam Patch. Because he was really, really popular. and took a lot of courage. I mean, to get the type of respect from a man like Andrew Jackson, who had been shot how many times and gone to war how many times, to get Andrew Jackson's respect that he would name his horse after you, I mean, the guy's jumping hundreds of feet. Seriously, next time you're like driving around or looking at a bridge or looking at a tree, think about how tall it is. That tree is probably only 80 feet high. What was that comment, Tarot? 2 of them died too soon back to back. You know what's funny is as I was telling the second story, that realized to me. I apologize for being very, very sad. Let's see. Saying this live is tape too slow and you pass when you're talking about before done. Type too slow. You don't have to. Well, you can definitely come prepared with questions. That's for sure. But even if you type slow, just type it in. I see it coming through. everything that anyone comments comes through to me like 7 or 8 seconds. I'm a little bit ahead of you. I think I have the ability to, like, if I say a bad word, cancel myself real quick. So everything comes through a little delayed. But I'm always looking every week. I'll go back and check, make sure I cover every question. If there's not something, like if we're talking about chocolate during the American Revolution, I'll write it down and try and bring it up next time. I'm going to take a sip of water. Because it got hot today. But I had to put my hat on because I was working in the yard. My hair's all messed up. Anyway, but yeah, Tarot, if you have any other questions, definitely feel free to ask them now. When I'm done, I will do an extra round of... Oh yeah, I'm only just drinking the water now. Okay. I will do an extra round of review to make sure I cover everyone. Don't you worry. We don't have enough people yet where I can't answer every question. It's a nice small group we have that shows up every week, so it's a lot of fun. Again, while I'm saying that, if I'm thinking about doing 2 hours later in the day on Wednesdays, that way the sun isn't shining through the window, and I know there's people on the West Coast who like to watch, and I realized, 4 o'clock on the West Coast, people might still be at work, so I was thinking about doing it at 9 Eastern, so it's 6 o'clock on the West Coast. Let me know. You guys have gotten in early enough on this train to legitimately affect the decisions I make. Let's see. And unfortunately, because we just did one on Saturday and it's only Wednesday, we only have one more founder this week. And that is William Hull. William Hull is a guy I really didn't know a ton about. I just happened upon the fact that he was the first governor of Michigan. So I dug into him a little bit. I'm pretty surprised I didn't know a lot about him. Although, I think I did hear his name because apparently he was friends. He was from Connecticut and went to Yale and graduated just before the Revolution broke out. And apparently he was friends with Nathan Hale, who's very famous as the first spy for the Continental Army, and probably, and a lot of people will get mad at me for saying this, the worst spy, because he got caught right away and got hung right away. I don't mean to laugh at his misfortune, but it's not. He was... I'll have to do a video about Nathan Hale, because he just does not do a very good job at being a spy. He just goes in and gives himself up and gets hung in like a week and a half. Anyway, William Hull was a friend of his, and apparently William Hull tried to talk him out of it. And when Nathan Hale died, he was attributed a famous saying that he probably didn't say. And the story goes that he said, my only regret is I have but one life to give for my country. And unfortunately, that was true, but it seems that this actually comes from a book that was famous at the time that many people enjoyed called Cato's Letters, and it's probably more accurate that someone, and according to the research I did, it was William Hull was the most important person in doing this. His friends gave him credit. William Hull gave his friend Nathan Hale credit for saying that in the papers. But it wasn't that he was saying, oh, he said this. It was, I'm going to quote Cato's Letters because it is how I feel that my friend Nate felt when he was hung. If you follow me. I only regret that I have one life to give for my country. And it's almost like if you go to a friend's funeral and you sing a song that someone else wrote because you think the lyrics apply to the situation, is essentially what Hull did. Anyway, Hull went on to serve for a full 8 years in the Continental Army and did a pretty great job. Then he ended up moving to Massachusetts, where he served as, a local judge. And I believe he served on the state assembly as a Democratic Republican. And he came to the attention of President Thomas Jefferson, who had just bought in this whole, Louisiana Purchase thing. And he needed someone to take charge of Michigan. And in 1806, William Hull was named the first governor of the Michigan Territory. Now at the time, most of Michigan was owned and controlled by Native Americans. And there was just a few forts that were run by... there were just a few... I see a question, I'll get right back to you. There were a few forts run by the governor... by the Americans. One of which was Fort Detroit, which we now know as Detroit. Most of it was controlled by Native Americans, and William Hull went out and actually negotiated to get a lot of this land freed up for white settlers, is the honest truth about it, but for American settlers, I should say, to also live on. The Treaty of Detroit. He negotiated with 4 or 5 different tribes, who many of whom were also at war with each other. So he did bring peace to the area, which there are a variety of ways we can look at this. Some of the tribes united against the Americans, sure. Some of it was due to the threat of violence, although at the time he had a very small force in Michigan compared to entire Native American nations. But either way, he negotiated and treated with the Native Americans in Michigan. And then a few years go by, and then the War of 1812 breaks out. And I didn't get too into this into the article I wrote, but Hull was in Washington, D.C. when this talk of war was going to break out. And they wanted to name him, they were creating the Army of the Northwest, which was a section of the United States Army. And William Eustis, who was Secretary of War, wanted to name Governor William Hull as Brigadier General in charge of this Army of the Northwest, because he was already the governor of Michigan. He was already going back out there. And Hull actually said no thanks. He was over 60 years old. He wanted to give it to someone younger and more vigorous so he could continue focusing his attention on running a territory which had been rapidly expanding over the 6-7 years he was in charge. They tried someone else, and that person didn't want it. And eventually, they went back to Hull, and he said, okay, I'm going back anyway. Okay. And this didn't work out great for him, because Hull ends up going, and he meets his men out west and leads them to Detroit, Fort Detroit. While he's there, word traveled slowly at the time, and word that Madison had declared war against Britain for the War of 1812 followed Hull as he traveled. And the British found out 2 days before that Hull did. And Hull had sent some men into Canada thinking they're not ready for this. We'll get a head start in case war breaks out. But the British already knew war broke out. And let's just say it didn't go well for the Americans, who quickly evacuated back across the water. Then the British sent word over to Hull and said, hey, we're going to invade you. We have thousands of Native Americans on our side, and we're going to slaughter. Basically, what the British general said when he sent over he sent a request for Hull to surrender, and essentially said, we have thousands of Native American troops. We cannot, if we unleash them on your fort, we cannot guarantee we can control them once they start going. And this was kind of a real threat, and especially with certain tribes that were involved. And Hull decided to surrender his men instead of lead them into a bloodbath or a siege that he was ill prepared for, because the war had just broken out, so the Continental Army had not resupplied them. And I forgot to mention that, again, this is on the Great Lakes, and Hull had long been promoting to Madison and to Jefferson before that, and to Washington, D.C., hey, we need to build a navy on the Great Lakes, because the British have one, and we won't be able to put up much of a fight, especially in a remote place like Detroit at the time. So Hull, now being in a situation where he was super ill-prepared to fight a war, had already lost a skirmish of sorts, because the British were told, because they had a navy that got them information, that the war had started, and he hadn't known yet. He quickly surrendered his army. And this didn't go well for him. Now, we look back, and the historians I've read generally look back with sympathy at Hull, because there wasn't a whole lot he can do. I basically laid it out in the sympathetic manner that historians currently view Hull's actions. At the time, it was, why didn't you invade Canada? Why did you back off? And why did you just surrender your army without a fight? And Hull was court-martialed, convicted of negligence and cowardice, and sentenced to die. Thankfully, President James Madison pardoned Hull for his crimes, due mostly to his heroic service decades earlier in the American Revolution. He was removed from office as governor and went back to Massachusetts, where he had made his home, as a disgrace, and was embarrassed about the whole thing. About a decade later, over the course of the next decade, he published 2 books that attempted to vindicate himself based on what happened. And surprisingly, they did. Most of the people who read it, with a little bit of distance between the end of the war and reading it, most people seem to have said, okay, maybe we judged him a little hard. Like, that's right, we didn't tell him the war started. Whoopsie daisy. Probably should have given him a heads up on that. And luckily his reputation was regained a bit. Unfortunately, that was just a few months before he passed away. Now, he wasn't a much older man at this point, so, you know, he seems to have died of natural causes, but luckily he did get his name cleared before any of that happened. Now, I saw a bunch of things being said. Uh-oh. Hercules Muscle Man, you're redacting a bunch of things, huh? Say it with confidence, man. I'll listen. Hercules Mulligan is the best spy on the British. Fair enough. By Cato's letters, is that referring to Cato? Backwards. Hercules Mulligan's servant, Cato, was named after Cato's letters. Or, I would assume, because, like I said, Cato's letters was a very popular book at the time. I want to say series, but it wasn't. I believe it was just one book, even when it was first published. It was very popular. It was from a while before the Revolution, probably 50, maybe 100 years, but it was still a classic that people read and respected and would name their servants after. Unfortunately, even the great servants who really helped us win the war. And by servant, I certainly mean slave. Which is why Cato doesn't seem to have a last name. Like many people, like, York, who I discussed recently, who worked with William Clark. We hear, it definitely happened that slaves had last names. The Hemings family, for example, Sally Hemings, Peter Hemings. But, anyway, I've digressed a bit. But, thank you for pointing that out. That is a great connection, Mr. Muscleman. If you guys have any other questions, now would be the time. We're at 43 minutes. It's just about where we hit. I usually do 2 more, but as I said, we've moved it to Wednesday. And therefore, I'm going to be too short this week. As for next week, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to go about it. I like the idea of ending with the Federalist paper. I was thinking about discussing tomorrow's article today, so that when next Wednesday comes around, I can start on Friday and start with the Federalist paper. Would you like me to discuss? You want a hint as to what we're publishing tomorrow? It is about a massacre. Uh-oh. That's the easiest to get clickbait on. No questions, thanks. Okay. Alright, well, definitely read tomorrow about a fun massacre in the Revolutionary War. Other than that, I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you so much for watching. As I said before, if you did want to support the site, you can either check out my Patreon page. I have a few tidbits I offer on there, or check out my shop. I have merch with my logo on it, so if you really want to support me, you do that. But I also have a bunch of fun quotes from the founders that I personally love. That's why I made those t-shirts. I made shirts I wanted to wear. They don't sell well. Not a lot of people have them. But I'm sure you'll like at least one of the quotes. So check them out. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll be back with a regular video tomorrow. I was supposed to get ready to hit end stream by then. I'll be back with a regular video tomorrow.